Welcome to T.S.O.B with Dr. G, a podcast featuring intellectual table talk about race and sexuality. I'm your host, Dr. Tracy Q. Gilbert, a sexuality educator, writer, and researcher. Join me as I talk with the most brilliant minds in human sexuality, applying a professional Black lens to discussions about sexiness, health, and healing in the new millennium. It's T.S.O.B, the sex ed of Black folk. Let's get to the get down, shall we? All right, everybody. Hello. Welcome to another episode of T.S.O.B with Dr. G. I'm Dr. Tracy Gilbert, and as usual, I am super excited to be here with you all. This season, like I said, I'm just having a lot of amazing people. Last season, I had mostly like my friends and people I knew directly. This season, I'm inviting people that are like friends in my head and like just people that I'm like super fans of. So this person is no exception. I'm talking about none other than Raquel Savage. So I'm going to read Raquel's bio. We are going to chop it up and hopefully we're going to have an awesome conversation. No, hopefully it's going to be awesome. So let me go ahead and get started. Raquel Savage was born into a life of bold resistance that she attributes to her grandparents. Growing up watching her grandfather, a Methodist minister, transgress by fighting issues related to race and gay rights, Raquel grew up to have a deep appreciation for social justice and an understanding of the importance of standing behind the righteous thing. Her grandmother, a rebellious preacher's wife, was an ASSECT-certified sexuality educator. Shout out to all the ASSECT-certified educators. And she was opinionated and fearless. As Raquel got older, she furthered her work in sexual liberation work via education. During her undergrad, she created organizations like the Q Group, where she created a space for queer students and later earned a board certification in human sexuality. Currently, Raquel holds a master's in counseling, marriage and family therapy. Ms. Savage is also committed to making her work accessible, substantial, and personal. She does sex and trauma coaching and Savage Sex Ed. Raquel facilitates sex and trauma coaching sessions where she is able to personalize her labor and wisdom in an intimate setting. Savage Sex Ed includes interactive workshops, which can be held privately or publicly and range from topics like fetishes, ethical non-monogamy, and orgasm. Savage Sex Ed consultations allow people to pick Raquel's brain about a topic of their choice, and in all ways, Raquel Savage is committed to educating. Raquel Savage is one of the most progressive and promising brands in media. I absolutely agree with that, and she shows no signs of slowing down. She isn't just a woman with a brand and a passion, but she has a mission, and that mission is to turn shamed folks into unapologetic, fearless savages too. And now y'all know why, of course, I had to ask her to be on this show. So without further ado, thank you so much for being here, Raquel. I'm so excited to speak with you today. How are you?
I have never had somebody read that bio like that before. It's interesting because when you said, I'm just going to read it from your site, I thought you meant from the frequently asked questions page, and under like the first question under the FAQ is like about like what do I actually do, and it has a
Oh.
bunch of stuff. And so I've never had anybody actually read like the about me. So that was pretty cool to hear.
Oh yeah, I love that, and I was just so excited about the pieces that I didn't know about you. Right, about your grandmother being an ASSECT certified educator. I'm super excited about that too. So
Yeah, that's
yeah.
awesome. That's cool.
Yeah, that was dope. So we're gonna jump right in. Like I said, you've already seen most of the questions. I do have a couple. The main one I start with, that I start with every single person on this show, is it's a three-parter. Where you from? Where are your people from? And what's got you thinking about sex and sexuality these days? So I'm gonna turn it over to you and go ahead and go in.
So I was born in California, but I grew up in Maryland, mostly in Howard County, which is 15, 20 minutes outside of Baltimore. And where are my people from? So my mom's side of the family is from like New England states. I'm mixed,
Mm.
black and white. So my mom is white, New England, white folks, colonizers up there. And then
Hmm.
my dad's side is in Cali, but also a little bit of ancestry is in Texas. So that's where my people are from.
Yeah.
And I have lived in Miami for like 7 years. So I moved here after I graduated from my undergrad. And
Yeah.
Miami is my favorite city ever. And then what was the third part?
What's got you thinking about sex and sexuality these days?
It's really the timing of this interview is so interesting because while I am a sex educator and I do talk about sex and sexuality a lot, I have shifted a lot in the last year or so into talking about sex and sexuality from a perspective of mental health and trauma versus like teaching people how to like suck dick or, sexual dysfunctions or like the fancy fun, not even fancy, the fun stuff, the provocative stuff. So honestly, a lot of what I've been thinking about recently around sex and sexuality is related to trauma.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think that the majority of my sex education and like my work in general exists on Patreon, and anyone who is a subscriber of is a patron on my Patreon, I think has the best inside look at my life and what I'm going through. And I would say that the content is always parallel to what is of interest to me at the time.
Yeah.
So a few years ago, I think I started the Patreon in 2018. The first couple of years was like talking a lot about sex work, teaching people how to eat pussy, teaching people how to ride, teach people about orgasms, talking a lot about, I don't know, like I said, I guess the fun stuff of sex. And
Right.
that's also parallel to what I see a lot of other sex educators doing. There's lots of like how to intimacy and how to please your partner and whatever. And then maybe like a year and a half ago, I personally had a relationship that prompted me to want to talk more explicitly about assault, abuse, and how mental health impacts your sexuality. And then the pandemic happened, and then it was even more of people who are living with their partners not really because they desire to, or their proximity is not really what it used to be, but they have to be in this proximity because of the pandemic, and it's cheaper to live together. And then there's all these questions about like how do you navigate living with your partner and y'all are fighting and y'all aren't even having sex anymore, and it
Right.
all was related to like trauma and mental health. So there was like all of these things kind of happening that shifted my focus. And so I've done a lot of writing and videos recently on gaslighting and emotional abuse and things that don't feel like they're related to our sexualities, but very much so impact the way we show up sexually. So yeah, it's really been, I think, a good evolving conversation for my patrons and I, because they got the kind of fun stuff and now we're growing into more complex and nuanced topics. And there's
Yeah.
also those sex educators who are doing the teaching you how to have an A-spot orgasm. You like that still exists if they desire that kind of content. I honestly don't see a lot of sex educators doing the more difficult topics. And I think sometimes as sex educators, we get like pigeonholed into doing the fun stuff and not talking about the serious stuff. So I'm glad that it feels personal to me, and I'm glad that I'm able to do that, and that it's my patrons are responding in a meaningful way, because it seems like
Yeah.
information that people need, even if it's not fun.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I appreciate you saying that because I think sex ed to the outside world can look very kind of one sided and just kind of be focused on the fucking and just focused on kind of the act, right?
Yeah.
Without realizing that not only is sexuality education this really huge wide world, in many cases it's not even sexy at all. It's in
Right.
some cases it's not that fun.
Right.
And What I love how to my eyes you seem like one of those educators who can kind of balance both, and that was one of the reasons I was like, I definitely have to get Raquel on this show, because while we love to talk about the fun stuff and we can talk about the juicy stuff, it's also important to kind of have that well-rounded conversation that's not just titillating but also intellectual. And so I'm really glad to be able to have you here to get into all of that. So we're
Yeah.
definitely going to get into all of that in just a second. I do want to back it up and ask you, just going back to where you said your people were from, and right, this kind of thing of your mom being from New England and your dad being from Texas. I'm curious about what that was like to have those differences, those cultural differences come together, and were there cultural differences, and what it was like being a kid in that kind of context.
Yeah, so I was raised predominantly by my mom and her family. So I was raised by white folks. And yeah, so there wasn't really the cultural influence more so for me, and definitely as I look back now as someone with a clearer politic, a stronger identity. it was it's white folks, and it is. I'm not a fan of white folks, and that extends to my family as well. And my family specifically are the liberal kind of white folks who are like,
Hmm.
we support. We're so progressive. And they're all educators, actually. My mom is a band teacher. Her partner is a music teacher. My aunt is a social studies teacher. Literally, everyone are teachers.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
you know, there were many things that were really, really wonderful about my family that absolutely informed who I am today. For example, teaching me about autonomy, making decisions on my own, having a strong sense of self, having my identity and core values in making what feels like doing the right thing, right?
Hmm.
Compassion, humility. Those were really important concepts that I have later developed into other things. But then there was the other side of it that was true to anyone who, if you know any like white liberals, is at the end of the day, they're still white and their interests are still centered around whiteness.
Hmm.
However, they're just like covered in this kind of facade. And that can be really confusing, I think, as a kid, especially as like the one black kid in the family. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah, it was a lot of different things. And I think also it impacted how I showed up in different kinds of spaces and how I made sense of things. I was just thinking about this the other day. Like, when I went to school, I was expecting that everyone had the core value of like doing the right thing and treating people with a sense of compassion and being Christ-like, because that's what I taught was taught. And then
Hmm.
I very quickly was like realizing that that's not
It's not.
what people are
Not
taught.
everybody's on the same page.
Correct. And more to the point was that how the lens in which I was taught that was very white. It is
Mm.
very white to be able to say like treat people nicely and don't fight
Hmm.
back when someone go tell a teacher. But like when you're navigating the world as a black child, as a black person in general, as a woman, as a
Yeah.
queer person, as a sex worker, whatever, you are engaged violently consistently. So this whole like treat people with respect and non-violence and whatever, that shit is really not valid if you are navigated in a way that's violent. So,
Right.
and it was not something that I could really talk to my family about because their value was centered in this peace and nonviolence, which again I think is wonderful, and it's not nuanced enough because it was from a lens of white folks. So I had to learn on my own and very quickly kind of how to navigate different spaces. And I think just like any mixed kid, we're really fucking confused. We have a lot of identity crisis and issues. We take up a lot of space when we need to just be quiet and sit down. There's a lot of, I think, stuff around race and identity, and specifically when you're, it's like a running joke to tell mixed kids to shut up, and I agree because in many ways we can play to our proximity to whiteness in a way that's violent.
Mm.
and
Hmm.
i and I think that people don't realize, or rather we don't make enough space to talk about like what it's like to be raised by a fucking white person, and that what the fuck, like what kind of crisis and confusion that creates. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, okay, yeah, and I love having conversations with other Black folks who have different kind of lenses like that, particularly folks who might be biracial or they come from other places outside of the U.S. Because I have the standard Negro Black American experience, right?
Yeah.
So to hear these other stories, it's like, wow, I never thought about that, and wow, I love that's why I asked that question to really and to not only help me but to help our listeners understand that the real meaning when we say we're not a monolith, like that literally means, how we come to our understanding of our blackness is all different. How we even understand other people as a function of how we've been racialized is all different. So I just really, really love hearing that, and I appreciate you sharing that with us.
I didn't get really a chance to, or not even that I didn't get a chance, I didn't begin to engage anti-blackness and really what it means to be a black person, a black woman, and kind of exploring systems of oppression and just power dynamics and all of that until I was 24. Um,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
when I first moved to Miami, the first thing I did when I got to Miami was I got my ass done. And
Mm.
so
Okay.
I was laid out for the first like 2 or 3 months just at home having to hang out and chill.
Right.
And the timing of that was so critical because it allowed me, or rather I had the time to sit and watch when Mike Brown was murdered, and
Mm.
the following kind of protests and things that happened around that, that was all I was doing when I was like recovering from surgery. And that was the first time I think that I got radicalized. So
Mm.
let me rephrase that. That's not the first time that I thought about my blackness at all. However, it's the first time that I got radicalized in a way where I was like, fuck the bullshit. We need to
Mm.
break it down for real. And from
Right,
there,
right.
I've only developed a stronger sense of that and a deeper understanding of systems of oppression and what it means to be Black and what it means to be a light skinned Black person and what it means to be a
Yeah.
biracial light skinned Black person and a number of kind of things. But yeah, that moment I always name as a moment that radicalized me for sure.
Got you, got you. Yeah, and I feel I feel like every Black person has one. It's sad. I say funny because you have to laugh to keep from crying, but it's kind of interesting to me how everybody has their one, and mine is like Amadou Diallo, right? And like now, I think just this past week we're recording this in April, so we just came off the heels of like three separate stories
Yeah,
that came out this past week. One of
yeah,
the killing of a 13-year-old boy, and people are like, "But he was 13," and I'm thinking, "But Tamir Rice was 12," right? Like, again, we've got
yeah,
stories, we've got a whole archive at this point, and so it's just it almost like can freeze you up if you get so bogged down just because there's just so
yeah.
many stories. So I'm curious then, particularly if for it being a late radicalization, to use your word for you, how often do you factor in or think about sexuality and sex within your understanding of your race consciousness and how that gets factored in? Does that factor in for you at all?
So the same time that I was becoming radicalized watching the protests was the same time that I started doing sex work.
Mm,
And I don't know that I've ever thought of that as having any kind of a connection. And I don't know that it really does. It more so was just a matter of timing and needing money and needing a job.
mm-hmm,
So there's that. But that is just an interesting coincidence. Otherwise, I don't know that as I was experiencing things like prior to the radicalization, like before 24,
mm-hmm,
that I was understanding things or experiencing things from a lens or perspective of people navigating me and my sexuality as racialized. I knew that I was Black. I knew that I have experienced racism. I knew that I was treated differently and things were different for me. But I don't think as it was happening, I really made that connection in a meaningful way. As an
mm-hmm,
adult now, I
mm-hmm,
absolutely can look back and say, the reason that the teachers were behaving in A, B, and C way towards me, the reason that my friends' parents were behaving this way towards me was not because I was just a little white girl doing, is because I was a Black girl doing A,
mm-hmm,
B, and C, right? So
mm-hmm.
now with the lens that I have, I can absolutely look back and like take a microscope and be like, yeah, that shit was specifically around my Blackness and womanhood and how that is sexualized, even though I was a kid.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. Absolutely.
so yeah, and then I think post radicalization and identifying as a sex work, that's a whole that's like a whole other umbrella realm, whatever, of being treated differently because I am Black. I mean, I think that I've done pretty well for myself as an educator, therapist, sex worker, whatever. And I can
Mm-hmm.
say very clearly that with the knowledge that I have, with the ability to make things relatable, whatever that I have, if I were white doing the same work, I would
Mm-hmm.
literally be famous. Like
Mm-hmm.
when I
Mm-hmm.
see other things happening in entertainment that are around sex and sexuality and sex workers, it is almost always a white woman. And I just
Mm-hmm.
continuously think to myself, if I were white,
Yeah,
the level to my reach and would be much different. So
absolutely.
I definitely understand it now. And then even just existing like as a Black queer sex worker woman online, the way that people treat me and other Black sex workers is horrific
Yeah.
compared to people. I mean, So yes, there's a very clear and obvious lens to me now that I'm understanding what that would even look like for me to recognize it.
Yeah, yeah, wow. And I'm like, I want to ask you all the questions because you're like sharing so many things that I'm like, I want to learn more. I would love to learn more about that. And hopefully we'll have a chance to get into those parts of the conversation too. But even just kind of coming back, right, and thinking about your journey, especially since you had a grandmother who was ASSECT certified, did you ever early on have an interest in doing sex in sex ed, or like how did you even get to where you are now in terms of like the counseling and the therapy and the education? And you mentioned how you got into sex work, but I love how you've been able to integrate them all together. And so please tell us your sex ed journey, how you even got into this work professionally.
So I honestly have always been a very sexual, sensual person, and I
Mm-hmm.
think if I were to do like a deep dive into why that is, there would be a number of reasons, whether it be that that was just like inherently my personality, whether it be because of trauma, whether it be because of being like bipolar and ADHD and that being a sense like a sensory stimulation thing,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be there's so many different reasons. And to just make it concise, I've just was always exploring shit. And then I always had friends too who were like, let's explore some shit. Like I have just so many stories and I talk about them a lot on my podcast, The Savage Life, where when I was
Yes.
a kid, we just did so much like sexual exploration shit. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really normal, FYI, for kids to be doing same age sex exploration kind of stuff. Not literally
Absolutely.
having sex, but sexually exploring things.
Absolutely.
And that was definitely my thing for sure. And I think the combination of that existing, of my family not being super conservative, of them being pretty, again, quote, progressive and really drilling into me messages around autonomy, right? Making sense of this is my body, how do I get to decide things about my body?
Mm-hmm.
I just was, and I was just rebellious. So, I don't know. I was just doing all this sexual shit from early on until whatever, right? And so
Yeah.
part as a result of that meant that people would come to me to talk about and do sexual shit. So
Yeah.
I, by proxy of that, just became like the go-to kind of person. And I don't think that I ever thought about it in a critical way. It was just like that's who I was, and that's what it was, and this is what the fuck it is. And what do you need
Mm-hmm.
to know, sis? Let me help you out.
Right, right, right.
And then I went to college and I got my undergrad in business communications. I wanted to be like Lala Anthony and be like a VJ on MTV or
Mm.
something. I just wanted to be famous. I didn't really care. I just was like, let me do something.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognized more specifically in college kind of the critical and political side of things, which is when I started the queer club at my college, which was very rebellious because I went to a historically all girls Catholic school that never had a queer club before. I was like
Mm.
pushing boundaries there. And I also think at that time I really realized how being the person whose reputation was centered around sex influenced my relationships with people and how I made sense of my sexuality. So, for instance, I've always been interested in relationships with people who are not men, but
Mm-hmm.
it became very sexualized where it was like I'm the girl who like everyone would go to have their girl experience. And while that's
Mm.
like fun, that's also really dehumanizing.
Objectifying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I kind of made that connection to and realized like wow, most of the relationships I've had with women, whether they were romantic, sexual, whatever, like have been very shallow and I haven't even really experienced the level to which I want to, right? So that just
Right.
started thinking about more things, but didn't put anything together. I just was like in college doing my thing. And then I graduated, couldn't find a fucking job to save my life. Just
Mm-hmm.
couldn't find like journalism jobs. Then I looked for like entry level. You have a undergrad degree jobs, wouldn't get hired there. Then I was like, all right, fucking let me look at retail. Wouldn't get hired there. I was not finding any work. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
prompted me to get into sex work and move to Miami. And I was like, I'm gonna be Amber Rose or Black China. Like I'm just gonna be whatever.
There it
And
is. Right.
simultaneously, though, I had a conversation with someone who worked at like a news station at a news station in Baltimore, and they were like, "What is your thing? Like, you can't just be famous. You got to have a thing. And I was like, I don't know what my thing is. And they
Have
were
you
like,
not seen folks in Hollywood? There's lots of folks that's famous with no thing.
which is true, but talking again about being racialized, I'm sure that that played into it, right?
Fair,
Because white folks definitely can get away with doing nothing and being famous. Uh,
fair, fair.
so they were like, you need to find a thing. And so it took me about a year to really think about that. And like I said, I had started doing sex work. I was in Miami. I was getting a lot of it. I was getting a lot of attention in the sex work industry. And I was like, oh, right, people be talking to me about sex. So maybe I can just like make that into a career somehow. So I started
Mm-hmm.
doing research and I was like, oh, I'm going to become a sex therapist. And then I was like, that's cool.
Yes.
And then it was like, bitch, you got to get your master's to become a sex therapist. I was like, oh, fuck, well, I guess I got to go back to school then. And went back to school, got my master's, got a separate certification in human sexuality. And honestly, when I look back at everything and I think about where I am now,
Mm-hmm.
there was zero really intention in how I was doing things. I have to thank my spirit guide who just
Mm-hmm.
must have known and does know this is the things, so do
Yeah, yeah,
it. And
yeah.
just like I really cannot. I can. There was no like. Here's the plan. I'm gonna do it like this. I'm gonna execute it. It's gonna be boom. And now I'm here. Wow, I did a great job. It was literally like,
Right.
all right, well, I'm gonna do. Okay, well, we gonna see about this, and it just
Yeah.
worked out honestly. And yeah, and so now here I am as a therapist and doing sex coaching and doing trauma coaching and having a nonprofit where I'm allowed to kind of curate that space and doing all different kinds of things centering around my identity as a sex educator and sex worker and all of the peripheral things that come with that, including mental health stuff.
Yeah, yeah. What I'm hearing and what you're saying is divine guidance. Like I really honestly see like, oh, you got to where you were supposed to be because it was your calling. And so the universe
Yes.
moved itself to put you moved you to put you in position to do what you're doing. And I love that. I love folks, I feel like that's what all of us need. We all need to just be moved into where we're supposed to be. So I'm super excited about that. And I love what I appreciate just on a personal level is just how transparent you are about your sex work history, particularly because of the recent conversations. I feel like now I apologize to whoever else in the world who feels like they have some ownership over this term, but you were the first person I ever heard talk about whorephobia, right? And talked about the ways that sex workers are treated or mistreated in the work that they do. And for me as a sexuality educator, I really feel like I've started to see threads of that, not only just in the regular world, but also in terms of sex education itself, in terms of how sex ed happens, what topics you can talk about or not talk about, and all those things. So I would love for you, if you don't mind, kind of help folks understand even what is whorephobia and just your general thoughts about that concept and how it shows up in the world.
I love that I was the one who introduced you to that word, and I also want to name very clearly that I did not create and coin that term. That is a
Okay.
term that I learned. So, whorephobia is the hatred, contempt, disgust of sex workers. And more specifically, sex work is an umbrella term, right? And it encompasses everyone who's in the sex industry: strippers, sugar babies, cam girls, porn people, full service sex workers, right? But when we
Mm-hmm.
talk really about whorephobia and sex work, we're really centering the experiences and then the discrimination and hatred of street based sex workers, right? Who
Mm-hmm.
typically, when we think of them, are black and brown, queer and trans, right? So
Yes. Yes.
when you think of whorephobia, although it does expand to everyone in the sex industry and peripherally to non-sex workers as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because civilian women have experiences of whorephobia by proxy of it being a way to shame and control women in general. But I
Mm-hmm.
want to make sure that folks understand that it's not centered around like the experiences of strippers or the experiences of people in the porn industry. It really starts and is centered in this true disgust, dehumanization of
Mm-hmm.
street-based sex workers. And then again, it affects everyone, yes, but I want to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that that's clear because sometimes this like sex work is an umbrella term thing. It gets watered down into something that doesn't make space for those who are the most criminalized and marginalized and vulnerable. So I want to
Mm-hmm.
make that clear. And then the other thing was what is my thoughts on whorephobia or personal experiences
Yeah,
or
or well, if you want to share that, I guess. And now that you're saying it, I recognize that I'm still new in terms of what I chew on or how I've been chewing on the concept. But for me, it even felt kind of bigger to really even look at like the hatred that's given to even precocious women, right? This I like women who have a lot of sexual knowledge, who have a lot of sexual confidence. I think of it as like the fear of fast tail girls, right? And this idea of like you can't be someone who loves sex, who is very clear about her sexual worth and is transactional with that and negotiates for a good price and all of those things. To me, that's kind of the whole concept too. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about even just the pervasiveness of whorephobia, how whorephobia intersects with sex ed, any other thoughts you want to share. And if you want to share personal experiences, feel free, but also you don't have to.
so what prompted me to start talking about whorephobia specifically really was me watching the music industry, specifically the rap girls, use sex work aesthetics
Mm-hmm.
to create platforms and popularity while
Mm-hmm.
presumably not being sex workers and not wanting to or totally ignoring the actual lived experiences of sex workers and the material impact and the criminalization of like just what that is like. And
Right.
so that's what prompted me to start talking about whorephobia and too much disdain. I got a lot of heat and still do for the
Yeah.
things I have said because ultimately I am critiquing people's faves, and we know that stan culture is absolutely toxic.
True.
So people
True.
have zero or little ability to objectively critique some of their fave artists because they see themselves in their artists in these artists, right? But
Absolutely.
so
But
that's
let's
what
break
made
that
me,
down.
yeah.
Let's break it down. Like, can you give us some examples of what you're thinking about? And I'm just gonna say, look, if Raquel says something you don't like, you can come to my DMs because I ain't scared of none of y'all. So we'll just put that out there before you get into it.
And I'm not scared of nobody either. I don't give a fuck
True.
about offending people when I'm critiquing people in that way. And I also have existed online and in life long enough to know that people can say whatever the fuck they need to say and want to say, and it is not a direct influence on my personhood or value.
Actual
So
facts. Yeah. Yeah.
um, yeah. So what the first thing that I did was I found out, I don't even remember now how I kind of became aware of Meg the Stallion, but someone I think suggested that we get her on the podcast. And
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't really heard her music at that point, but I was like, I would love to, like, I will, let's go. And then I heard her
Right.
music and I was like, oh, she's talking about slut shit. Like, she's with the shits. Like, she's talking
Right.
about selling pussy. And I'm like, I fuck with that. Like, here's a bitch who's talking about the shit that we be living. And
Right. Right. Right.
then
Right.
I heard I saw a clip on Twitter of an interview that she did and where she said something like she recycles her body so that she doesn't run up her body count. And I was like, are you selling
What?
pussy or not? Because no prostitutes give a fuck about a body count.
Right.
Moreover, how confusing is it that in your lyrics you talking about fucking and sucking and getting your shit ate, and then in real life you're talking about preserving your virtue, essentially, which ties
Mm-hmm.
into patriarchy and misogyny. So which is very confusing to me. And so I tweeted essentially, and it was my desire was to create conversation, not to make a definitive statement.
Mm-hmm.
Was essentially just wondering like how do we reconcile those things and how
Mm-hmm.
do we make sense of what it means to pander to men in a way that uses sex work aesthetics but erases the experiences of sex workers and ultimately still buys into patriarchy. And, just like
Mm-hmm.
what are y'all thinking? And it just
Mm-hmm.
exploded into this like I hate Meg. And then the funny thing was her stands
Mm-hmm.
in response to me asking these questions directed pretty violent whorephobia towards me. So these are people who are
Mm.
singing along to lyrics that are talking about selling pussy, but then when a bitch who
Right.
actually sells pussy makes a critique, it's you are a dirty fucking slut. You're selling pussy for $5. I seen your ashy ass And I'm like, so what is the truth? Like,
What's
what?
the truth? Is it Uchi
what
Wally or one mic?
like,
Which
like,
one?
is we pussy? Like, what? And so that was really what. And
Yeah.
then that later led me to write a piece in Bitch Media expanding more on sex work aesthetics being appropriated in general and specifically amongst the rap girls. And like, Saweetie, I think is how you pronounce her name. She has
Mm-hmm.
the that's my type, nigga, that's my type. And she's talking about rich dudes, but then later in the song she says something like, you bitches fucking for the rent, you a thought. And it's like, it just doesn't.
So yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
one of the things that I want to say, because I feel like this is important to say, is people don't owe anyone disclosure of their sex work identity. And we have to make space for what it means to talk about these things and romanticize and popularize and whatever
Mm-hmm.
these things in a way that separates them from the people who are actively doing them and who are the most vulnerable, right? So,
Yeah.
and then, another thing that kind of snowballed this was, and what really kicked off the continuing the romanticization and kind of normalcy of sex work in this separated way from actual sex workers is,
Mm-hmm.
then Meg went on to do the remix with Beyonce, and Beyonce says, I might start an OnlyFans. And that
Yeah.
essentially made OnlyFans a household name. And then we saw the impacts of that, which again had material impacts on actual sex workers, because at some point, I think Bella Hadid made an
Yeah, yeah,
OnlyFans
yeah.
a picture saying that it was a nude, but it wasn't, charged like $200 for it. And when everybody was rioting about that, OnlyFans decided to make there be a cap on the amount in which sex workers are allowed to charge in our DMs, right? So
Yeah.
like there's I really, my focus has been a lot around how sex work aesthetics, specifically full service sex work aesthetics, have been appropriated, and what it means for the culture
Mm-hmm.
and what it means for sex workers. And I have talked about it less recently because I don't feel like it at this point, but periodically I get like tweets where it's like, I saw something happen, and Raquel tried to talk about this a couple years ago, and y'all was trying to
Mm-hmm.
act like it wasn't, but now y'all are seeing it, So it's like that's
Right.
validating in some way, but it's also like I'm over it. I'm not over it, but I can't continue to center my like energy and labor around that when it's like y'all already know the point is that y'all hate sex workers.
Sure.
So
Yeah. 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 And I think as a layperson, I guess, what's frustrating to me is I still think there's this pseudo sense of freedom that's getting elevated of like, oh yeah, we're all being sexually free, but it's still amplifying the traditional Madonna whore complex and this idea of like all of us are either one or the other. And if you are playing like you saying appropriating the whore, then you have to at some point put the caveat in that's like, well, I'm not like the real ones, I'm this innocent one or this whatever, when the reality is not only is sex work valid, it's work, it's something that should be valid and should be properly protected, and that's a whole other conversation. But in many ways, all of us are operating transactionally when it comes to sex, if we're doing it right, in my opinion. But we're all, making clear negotiations of the things that we want, and there's nothing to be shaming or to feel ashamed about with that. And so thank you for breaking that down for folks. So when you think about your work and what you do, what would you say your sex ed superpower is?
I love that question. And actually, can I circle back to the whorephobia and sex education, because I don't feel like I
Oh,
said
well,
that.
let's get into it because I was going to come back to it, but we can
Okay.
do it now if you want to.
Okay, well, I was just gonna say, as you were talking, I was thinking about the ways that it shows up in sex ed, like you had
Hmm.
previously asked. So, do you want me to wait, or?
Well, you know what? Yeah, let's come back because I do. Yeah, I do want to really dig into that specifically within
Yes.
context of young people as well. But let's get into your superpower.
Okay.
Yes.
What is my sex ed superpower? That is a cute question. Honestly, I feel in many ways like my sex ed superpower would be similar to what my superpower would be in general, which is that I bring to the conversation and the table a variety of lenses that make what I'm saying feel more relatable and authentic because I actually do it.
Yeah.
So when I talk about trauma and therapy and mental health and processing trauma and holding space, that's because I'm actually doing that as a therapist. When I talk about um, learning how to have more transactional and affirming and empowering relationships with people, specifically cis men, whether you're a sex worker or not, right? Negotiating, getting your boundaries met, your needs met. That's because I'm actually doing it. When I'm talking about sucking dick for money on a yacht with NBA players, that's because I'm actually doing it.
Yeah.
So there is, I think, an authenticity to me that is largely what has made me successful because people know that I'm not bullshitting. People know that when I like log off of Twitter that I'm not actually a school teacher or, and like no shade to
Yeah.
school teachers, right? I'm just saying that my all of my identities are actually real.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so yeah, I think that would be like my superpower is like you're going to get the real shit because I'm actually doing it.
Yeah. And what I love about you. I'm just gonna fangirl real quick. What I will say, not even just love, what I'm impressed about is like I feel like you are such a kick in the throat to people who want to just kind of pigeonhole people into one category, right? Like, oh, you're a counselor. That means you have to, especially as a black femme counselor, you have to look like this. You have to have that nice suit picture and, give honor to God or just have this particular image, right? If you're a sex worker, you can't be smart. You can't have any type of intelligence. You just got to be, and you got to be tragic. You got to be stressed out, right? If you're an educator, you have to either be fun and not actually really know things, but just, have fun and play with toys and, and it's like you really, to me, I'm like, I need you to know that I root for you all the time. Like, I just I'm always like, get them, just fuck them up. They need to know that we have multitudes. So I really appreciate, and I agree. I think that is a superpower that you have of just really being able to hold all those things. And just when people understand you, it's like, you thought, here's another layer. And we're going to go with it. And I'm still the same person I was when I said the other thing the other day as well. So,
Thank you. I appreciate that.
yeah, definitely. Let's get back to the education piece. And I would love to, because I'm always thinking about, like, I know we are the world, but I'm also black. And I also grew up in black community. And I'm very concerned about the specific conversations we have intraculturally. So I would love for you to talk about what you feel like black people in particular, what are some of the places where we can stand to do better when it comes to maybe even thinking about whorephobia or thinking about sexuality in general, or just places where we just got it fucked up and we just need to be doing better? Like, how would you answer that question?
Black people in general or black sex educators?
Either or. Either or.
I would say in general, and this applies to sex educators and anyone else, is moving away from, or rather diversifying, not only the people that you're in community with, but the way that you create and center your content around. So much of what I typically see is like everything. And this is a reflection of culture in general. So it's really not unique to black folks, but because we are black folks, I want black folks to do it better.
Yeah.
Everything is centered around cishet women and cishet men.
Yes.
And more specifically, the conventionally correct version of that. So the black love and the attractive.
That's exactly where my mind went.
Right, and all of that. And I ask people and demand of people that they queer that, for starters. Like, not everything revolves around cis men and cis women, so let's just get that out the fucking way.
Right.
And that will not be reflected in the conversations that you're having or the content you're creating if you're not in community with queer folks. So, like, you need to motherfucking expand your community. And simultaneously, and perhaps before, is unpacking your homophobia and queerphobia and transphobia. So, because a lot of people are not doing that work, and that shows up in regular day-to-day conversation and in any kind of professional career spaces. And then in addition to that, doing the same thing with sex and sexuality and sex workers, right? So unpacking and starting to interrogate beliefs and things, practices that you uphold that are aligned with rape culture, and things that are
Mm,
misogynistic or internalized misogyny, right? If you are a woman, and things that uphold and perpetuate whorephobia, right? Like really starting to interrogate all of the isms and phobias in a way that you can take accountability for what you have done, the harm that you have done, the harm that you will continue to do by proxy of your identity, and how you can actively and always be an accomplice to these other communities because they all were our community. Like
yeah.
you cannot be pro-black if you are not pro-black trans women and
Period.
pro black sex workers and pro black disabled people and pro black queer women who are not femme identified and don't give a fuck about men. Like
Yeah.
you have to, it's either all of us or it's none of us. So
Right.
yeah, that would be my ask continuously of black folks for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let me, just for the folks who may not be clear, can you give a brief understanding of what is rape culture that you mentioned that?
Yeah, so rape culture is the trivialization, the normalization of sexual assault and the various ways that that shows up in our community and
Yeah.
media and culture and whatever else, right? So that can look like so many different fucking things. That can look like victim blaming, right? Well, she was wearing a skirt, or that can look like making it a joke or not that serious that someone got another person drunk in order to essentially decrease and shift their decision making in order to have sex with them.
Mm-hmm.
It can look like literally any rom com that you watch. Put on any fucking rom com, and you see that the center of the premise of the fucking movie is about like wearing down the woman so that she eventually falls in love with the man, right? Like there's so many ways, and we'd be here forever, but those are the things I can think of off the top of my head.
Sure, sure. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So yes, let's do the sex ed thing. Let's talk about whorephobia and sex ed and what's on your mind. Do you still remember it?
Yeah, so I was really just going to say that as a sex educator who is also a sex worker, I so frequently see other sex educators, specifically black sex educators, who are just missing the fucking mark when it comes to
Mm,
encouraging people to really unpack what is their misogyny and ultimately whorephobia, because I see sex educators talking about like unpacking shame around your sexuality and feeling good about your sexuality and whatever, but it's missing the entire angle of whorephobia, which is the foundation of that conversation. So
mm-hmm.
it's like, oh well, you learned growing up that you had to behave in this way and unpack that and feel good and feel empowered, but it's like, how are you even having that conversation with people without explicitly saying you learned that because you learned that whores, that street-based workers who are selling pussy
Yes.
for $25 are the scum of the earth. Like that's
Yeah.
how you learn that. And
Yeah.
so if we can figure out how to humanize folks and make space for folks and talk about, then you can really think about how you can unpack that internalized bullshit. Otherwise, it's
Yeah.
it's fake.
Yeah. And what I love about like to me, I make the link because again, a lot of my focus is on at the K-12 level, and I make the link thinking about the girls who may not have gotten to the formal level of being sex workers, but they have sex. They maybe have a quote unquote high body count, and they're treated as if, oh, they're the worst thing ever. They're traumatized, and oh, something happened to them when they were younger. They have these different things, and I think particularly as black femmes, I think there is this conversation that we don't have about how black girls often have to walk this line of anything that they do, they can be judged either or, and so they pass on that judgment to the girls who are actually on the other side of the line to kind of like pit themselves against it, when it's like we're all in the same boat and we're all just at different places in terms of what we like or what we don't like, or even how comfortable we are in saying what we like and what we don't like. And I think that, to me as an educator, when I then go in classrooms and we start talking about, well, what is healthy sex and what's not healthy sex, I feel this frustration, and I hope other educators can relate to this frustration of wanting to say, let's talk about desire, let's talk about pleasure, let's talk about the things that you would like to have happen, and talk about what it's like to be in an environment where even just saying, I would love to have sex with more than one boy, or I would love to have this happen, or I would love to have sex with girls, or I would love to do this, and how that can't happen because that's not healthy, or that it gets coded as like, oh, problematic, or all of these different things. And so for me, to me, there's like this through line from how young folks are taught to think about sex to whorephobia and all the things you're talking about in adulthood.
Absolutely. And more to the point is that some of these girls are traumatized. Some of these people have
Yeah.
had experiences in childhood, and we very rarely make space for that, which is also an extension of whorephobia, because we do this thing where we're like, we look at sex work as either it's so empowering, so amazing, oh my god, it's wonderful, they're making so much money, shout out to them, or they're doing it
That's a great
because
point.
they're traumatized, and they're this, it's this dichotomy, and it that never ends up humanizing anyone, right? And it also doesn't leave
Yeah.
space for these multiple experiences. So the reality is that some of us are having sex and exploring sex and sexuality because we're traumatized, and that's valid too. Let's hold
That's a
space for
great
those
point.
people who that's their experience, and it doesn't have to be this kind of like, yeah. So I just wanted to name that because
That's a great point.
when we yeah, when we start talking about that side of it, because it's the same thing, it's like, well, they're traumatized and they're doing this, then we don't actually get to talk about what that means, how that happens, how can we assist these people in healing the trauma and finding grounds that feel consensual and safe, right? Like we don't
Yeah.
even get to get into that. So yeah, it's when I think of kids and teenagers, whether it's like just talking about sex, not sex work specifically,
Mm-hmm.
people really freak out when they think about kids and teens being sexual or having
Absolutely.
sex, right? And
Absolutely.
people have no tolerance for emotional tolerance for, right? Like they cannot stay present in what they're experiencing when they think about kids and teens exploring sex. And it
Mm-hmm.
just leaves space for so much fucking vulnerability, because then kids and teens never get to learn anything good. And then they go on to have really traumatic, if not already, sexual experiences. And it's fucking horrific. And then the cycle just continues. So I
Mm-hmm.
really, I really feel like the conversation around kids and teens has to include or be centered around adults and how adults are engaging kids and
Yeah.
teens in order to even make that any kind of progress in that.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
a great point. That's a great point. Absolutely. Woof, yes. Right. So let's say then, Raquel, you've got someone listening who maybe is a parent and they're like, you know what? This is a little scary, but I think old girl is making sense. And they're like, but I don't know what to do next. What would you say for the person who's listening, who's like, I know, I hear you, I want to do better. Where do I begin? What do I do? What will you share?
I really think with parents, the first thing that parents need to do is, and this is really hard, and this is why it typically doesn't happen, is sit down and start reflecting on, interrogating, introspecting, whatever, thinking critically about what comes up for you when you start thinking about any of these things. And more than likely, it has nothing to do with your kid or the kids that are around you. It has to do with shit that you have experienced and internalized, which sometimes actually can be about the kid, because sometimes it's about like misogyny and patriarchy, which is about ownership, right? But
Mm-hmm.
really thinking about what comes up for you. What comes up for you, meaning what is the messages and the meanings attached to whatever you're thinking about. So you see your daughter in, I don't know, a fucking skirt or something, and you're like, the message and meaning that pops in your head is that's she's a slut. Okay, what are the things that you learned about sluts? I learned that sluts
Mm-hmm.
are bad people. And my dad told me that I would be a slut if I wore that. Okay, and how did that make you feel to identify with perhaps being aligned with being a slut? It made me feel like I was a bad person. Where did you feel that in your body? In my chest, in my back. And that feels really uncomfortable, right? Yeah, that feels really fucking bad. And thinking about kind of all of this bigger sphere of it's trauma,
Mm-hmm.
really. All
Mm-hmm.
of these things that we're carrying, and thinking about the internal voice, right? Like who's saying and who's repeating these messages? Is it your parents? Is it a church person? Is it you now? Your own voice? What are the things? There's like so many things, right? But I think
Mm-hmm.
really is encouraging parents to sit down and think about what comes up for them around without being impulsive, right? Because it's like normally something happens and we just immediately react without taking the time to say, wow, this is making me think of this, and this is feeling
Yeah.
really uncomfortable in my body and whatever else. So starting there for
Yeah.
sure. Um, the next thing I think would be is learning about isms and phobias, systems of oppression, because part of that is learning about how we dehumanize and treat children and kids because we essentially remove any autonomy from them and believe that we get to make decisions for them and they have no space to do whatever it is that they want to
It's
do.
our
So,
responsibility to make decisions for them, right? Like
correct.
not to teach them how to do it. Yeah.
Right. So learning about isms and phobias, which is very, I find doing that kind of psychoeducation with people is very helpful because it brings this factual lens kind of to the table where they're able to like make this connection in their head, like, oh, that's why A, B, and C. It's like, oh yeah, so now let's look at how that's been applied in your life. Let's see how you perpetuate that. And like an A B of the systems of oppression is figuring out what privilege identities you occupy. So, meaning, how are you responsible for perpetuating these isms and phobias, right? And what are the marginalized identities you occupy? How are you experiencing some of these things? How are you internalizing some of these things and then recreating them in your life? So, starting with those two things, then I think next would be, I think parents we have created societally this kind of expectation and role of parents as a I'm not I don't haven't really fleshed out like the language around this yet, so let me know if you follow me. It's like it becomes a role and less of an experience of personhood for your kid. And so the relationship like ends up revolving around like making asks of them, setting rules and boundaries for them and not relating to them as a person.
Yeah.
And so kids end up not really having a relationship with you or knowing you and it's not reciprocal in that way, so it ends up being superficial and there is no safe space in that because
Yeah.
there's nothing to it, there's nothing
There's no
there.
experience. What I'm hearing is like the difference between the role of being a parent and the experience of parenthood and the experience of parenting, and how there's this simultaneous transformation that is supposed to happen in that you are here to help this young person grow, and they are here to help evolve you as an individual who has the responsibility of taking care of someone.
Correct, like the experience of you being two human people getting to know each other and not necessarily that
Yeah.
you are positioned as needing to do all of these things besides just be present with your human child.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there's something there that I think is really important because that levels the playing field in a way that really allows the both of you to have really honest, vulnerable, open communication.
Yeah.
And I think that for parents that can be difficult too because again they haven't done those first few steps. We're not able to be vulnerable with our kids because we're not able to be vulnerable in general, and
Yeah.
whatever the case may be. And I think what goes comes after that is the ability to create these spaces that feel safer, to be able to facilitate conversations with our kids that are difficult, and also being able to take the position of I don't know. Like my kid asked me something, and instead of being like, "Don't ask me that again," like just go play your game. It's like, I don't know, but you know what? Let's find out together. Let's figure it out
Yep.
together. I actually don't know. Or if something
Absolutely.
happens that makes you uncomfortable and your kid recognizes that, saying like, "I'm so uncomfortable right now.
Right.
I've never
And
done
it's
this."
okay for mommy to be uncomfortable.
Correct. And kind of doing that thing. And then I think another thing, right, would be then you get to take the position, or rather have the opportunity to be accountable to the ways that you've harmed your kids. Because it ends
Yes.
up unresolved harm and trauma in our kids means that our kids are not going to fucking trust us. They're not going to come to us for anything. They're not going to believe you when you say things. There's not going to be this ability to create anything meaningful with
That's
them.
it.
So when you because this none of this means that you're not going to snap on your kids, you're not going to do something wrong, whatever you are, and it's a matter of being able to say, I'm so sorry. I fucked up. I know that this hurts you. Please tell me more about how this experience was for you. I
Yeah.
will not do this again. How can I make amends? How can I ensure that it won't happen? And what is the thing that you need to repair this? Reparations, right? How can I repair this relationship with you? And not
Yep.
only is that important for their relationship with them and their ability to feel safe for you, it's also setting a model for them how to be accountable to other people in their lives. So there's
Absolutely.
like literally so
Absolutely.
many things. I feel like I could go on forever.
Yeah, no, no, I think those are amazing. And one other thing that's coming up for me, I want to make sure that I'm hearing you right. Going back to what you said about kind of doing that own work about, your own experiences and your own, kind of your own lens in terms of what were you taught to think about sex work? What were you taught to think about all these things? I often, when I do parent workshops, is talk about the projection that happens, where often we're projecting things on to our kid or onto kids, period, that is literally just a projection of what we feared when we were growing up or what we experienced, right? So maybe we were that person who was having sex at 11, 12, 13, 14, got and we're projecting that anxiety onto our young person's experience, or we're that person who, maybe physically developed faster and was adultified, and so now we've got that paranoia and we're trying to hyper protect our kid and assuming that what was happening, how they're processing things is their experience, when really it's just unresolved shit that we don't even recognize that we still feel about being a stallion, if you will, or being all of these things. And so that's also something that's coming up for me about that, the need to reflect on that, because I feel like a lot of us don't.
Right. And is that not true of any relationship, whether it's parent or otherwise? Anything that is unresolved, we end up recreating, projecting, whatever, self-sabotaging in all of the relationships that we have, which
Yeah,
is why I am an advocate for trying to do as much healing work as possible, given that you have the bandwidth
absolutely.
to do it, given that you have the funds and resources to do it. It is very meaningful work. And I also recognize, right, that all of the things that we just said, they largely are not possible if you are experiencing poverty, if you're experiencing homelessness. Like, your marginalized identities really do inform your ability to have any kind of
Sure. Yeah.
peace and contentment, because you're struggling to meet your basic needs. So I also just want to name that. I assume most of the folks listening are getting their basic needs met. So some of this stuff will be
Yeah.
applicable, but to also think about the fact that, especially like when you work with kids, right? Or if you're working with kids who are not your own, thinking about why they show up the way that they show up based on what's happening with them in their life, right? So
Absolutely.
maybe you and your kids got a more solid relationship because y'all have enough money and y'all have solid housing and y'all not experiencing consistent and ongoing state violence or whatever. Like, all of that impacts all of this shit. So I just want to name that
Yeah.
too. Like,
Oh yeah, sure. And I think what I hear and what you're saying too is just holding space and grace. So like being intentional and leaning towards that intention while giving grace as it's needed, right? To recognize that if you are in an acute situation or acute crisis of some kind, that it may not be that you get it right today. And just like you want to model for your young person how to be accountable, you also want to model for your young person how to hold grace for themselves and to hold grace for you, and so on. So I definitely hear that too. We're about to get to my rapid fire questions. Before I do that, I want to ask you, just because this last year and this year still feels like we're in this space of just a lot of just momentous change and just a lot of things just transforming in our society. And so I'm curious if you've thought about for yourself, in light of all this change and just kind of what's happening socially, about your unique role, particularly given your journey and how it seems so divinely orchestrated. Have you thought about what you see your unique role or legacy, if you will, in this work that we're doing for the world?
yeah, so legacy feels different than role. So I'll start with like future role.
Mm-hmm.
So I stopped doing full service sex work in 2019, and I still do like online sex work and probably will continue to as long as there's a bag coming from that.
Listen,
But
fair.
I really desire to, and am moving more into mental health and academic kind of spaces, and moving away from actively being a sex worker. So not only is that coming to fruition through Zep Wellness Center, my nonprofit, where I'm able to move kind of into doing more mental health centered stuff. I have been doing more lectures with graduate and PhD students, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
putting out into the universe that I would like to have at least a part-time position doing some kind of academic work at a school.
Done.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think I'm really moving towards wanting to do more of that kind of stuff, and I'm trying to write a book, and I'd love to have like a more concrete and quality like entertainment kind of stuff, like a TV show or something. So moving kind of into that sphere and away from doing active sex work, even though I will always identify as a sex worker and probably be doing sex work in some way, but that just
Yeah.
not being the center of my identity anymore. And in terms of legacy,
I know that's a big one. I actually tell people role, significance, and or legacy. So any of
Okay, all right.
those you
The role is good then. We got that covered. Okay.
yeah. I mean, without question, you clearly have a significance. And I think you'll be just part of the legacy of sex educators who just do it all and just, bust through the door and make sure that we're all here and present and accounted for. So I'll say that. Are you ready for the rapid fire questions?
Okay.
Okay. So these are just basic 5 sentence stems where you just answer based on whatever comes to your head, and we'll just get through them. So the first one is sexiness is.
The first thing I thought of was just like being fresh out of the shower.
Nice. Nice. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. The sexiest thing about blackness and or black people is.
Everybody wants to be us, that we are the originators, and more specifically, I think of black trans women are essentially the fucking blueprint for
Talk
everything.
about it. Talk about it. Okay? Absolutely. Um my go-to for feeling sexy is.
I don't know because I have not even been like thinking about sexiness at all.
You know what popped in my head? Because again, I've been your fan for a long time. I watching you on Instagram once, and what in your stories you were like twerking to the office thing, and I just thought I was like,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
yes, I love it.
Yeah, but probably against, I really like when I'm in my most like natural state. And for me, that is typically like right after I get out of the shower and I'm just like, that's where I feel the best.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, sexual freedom for Black folk is achieved when.
We unpack all of our isms and phobias and feel our
Amen.
feelings.
And feel our feelings. Come on, absolutely. Last sentence stem. When I am done being on this podcast, I will.
I'm gonna go continue to watch The Falcon and the Winter Soldier because I'm obsessed with Sebastian Stan.
Okay, okay. That the I will say all the comic book stuff. I'm like I study from afar. I know nothing about it, but
That's
I
fine. That's
respect
fair.
all the fans because I'm like y'all really be knowing what y'all talking about. I'm just like okay, just tell me when the next Black Panther coming out. That's all. Like shouts out to y'all. I love it.
Yes.
Raquel, tell the folks where they can. Honestly, I'm guessing most of the people who are listening are probably also fans of you and they already know where to find you. But just in case there's that one person living under a rock in Australia, tell folks where they can find you, all the good stuff that you have. This will be published in June. So anything you have coming up in May or June that you want to share, just talk your shit.
Cool. So you can follow me on Instagram at Raquel Savage, Raquel Savage, and on Twitter, Raquel underscore Savage. You can follow my nonprofit, Zep Wellness, on Instagram and Twitter at
Yeah.
ZEPP Wellness.
Tell us,
You
actually, before you move on, tell me more about that because I don't think I knew about that.
Yeah. So I started this nonprofit in 2019. 2020 last year was the first full year of offering services. We're a nonprofit mental health organization, and we offer services exclusively to Black, Indigenous people of color, sex workers, survivors, and queer and trans folks. So all of our services are also free. We offer free trauma therapy, free yoga, free trauma
Amen.
informed energy work. We do a rent relief program for Black trans women sex workers. We pay their rent. We have an art class where we get to draw our genitals. There's really so much that we do, but
Amen.
it's a mental health and kind of healing services thing,
Beautiful. Beautiful.
um, and exclusively staffed by the people that we serve as well, right? So our entire staff and board are Black, Indigenous people of color, sex workers, survivors, and queer and trans folks.
Love it. Love it. Love
And
it.
you can donate some money to Zep Wellness because we need your funds in order to offer fund.
I was gonna say
And
all this information will be in the show notes, so
yes,
please know.
bit.ly/Zep Wellness to give us some funds on the GoFundMe. And
Yes.
then, yeah, you can follow my production company, Kink Media Group, on Instagram, Kink, Kink Media Group underscore, and on Twitter, Kink Media Group. On Kink Media Group, I executive produce different projects for Black and queer folks and sex workers. So we have five different shows. And then I don't know, you can go to my Patreon if you want to get up close and personal with the educational and introspective work that I do, patreon.com/Raquel Savage. And then if you one of the freaks who want to spend some money, OnlyFans.com,
OnlyFans.
Raquel Savage. Give me some money, bring your wallet.
There it is. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Listen, all of it, all the things. Support this work. Listen, I am so thankful that you came and joined me today. I'm so thankful for this conversation. I know it's amazing. If y'all ain't excited or y'all ain't learned something, you need to go back and listen to it again, because this conversation was incredible. Thank you so much for being here. Thank y'all for listening. We will talk to you next time. And in the meantime, take care. Bye. You've been listening to T.S.O.B. with Dr. G, produced by Dr. Tracy Q. Gilbert of Tempe, Anaya. To keep up with all things T.S.O.B., follow us on social media at T.S.O.B. the podcast, which you can find on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. For past episodes of the show, visit tsobpodcast.com or subscribe to the show either on YouTube or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Now, don't forget that you've got homework for this episode. To find the downloadable worksheet for this or any other episode of the show, head on over again to tsobpodcast.com, where you'll find it and any other important information from the show notes. And finally, do you have any questions or thoughts to share? Sound off by email at mailbox@tsobpodcast.com. Again, this was T.S.O.B., the sex ed of Black folk. Thank you for listening. Talk again soon.